In my last couple of videos in this Zynq-7000 series, I had posted that I was able to get my UART working. That would be coming through this USB-C connector here, then basically coming through this IC right here to get up to my FPGA. I was also able, once I had that running, to be able to load a program to actually do testing of the DDR memory over here and interact with the processor basically through this UART and tell it which commands to run and see the results of the DDR tests. And that all has been, it tested out fine, I think, and it's been working fine since. The follow-up video I had to that was I had populated the HDMI portion of my board, and the connector is on the bottom side, so you don't see it here in this picture, but I was able to generate HDMI output, so that was working fine. Since those two videos, I have posted a couple of community posts on my YouTube channel. One is I had commented that I finished populating the rest of the board. So this entire board is populated, maybe with the exception of this little header here, which I am waiting for the right size part to come in for that. But I have, all of my Ethernet, a USB connector for future USB host type functionality. And my SD card, all of that got populated along with the ICs that go with that. So the board is fully populated, and I was able to validate that Ethernet is working. And I posted on my community just a quick snapshot of what that looks like, basically using this raw mode TCP server application in Vitus to run that on my Zynq, and then using a client running iPerf2, and I was able to get 940 megabit roughly between an old laptop that I plugged into a switch with a DHCP server, and then this was plugged into that. The next step for me then is to get this right here going, the SD card. And you can see in this picture I have an SD card inserted, and I have been able to boot up to petalinux. And it's not fully functional, but at this point what is functional is, I believe, the SD card reader, the circuit for that, and my ability to load images on it and boot up to those images. I will comment that the world of petalinux seems like it's deep and dark. I think there's a lot to it, and it's not something that I'm going to quickly pick up all the nuances. But I have been able to get the basics up and running, and I know I have more to figure out. Especially one of the things I have to figure out is, I think, network drivers. So I'm having difficulty just with what I've done so far, at least getting this specific Ethernet circuit to work within petalinux. But if you've not done anything with petalinux, I'm brand new to it, but I'll show you what I had to go through really to get to the point that I could put on something bootable on this SD card right here. Now, before I flip over to that, I will comment I've got these jumper switches over here that let me choose my boot mode. And if you compare this to other people's boards, I think some people, they'll put it's M0, then they'll do M2, and then M1. I have M0, M1, M2. So if you're comparing dip switch jumpers for boot mode, just keep that in mind. Mine might not be in the same order that other boards are using. But right now I've got the set to boot to SD card is how I've got these switches configured. But let me show you what it has taken me to get that up and running with this SD card. So I'm going to connect to one of my remote machines here. It's just a title up workbench up here. And on that workbench computer, I have loaded up, and I use Oracle VirtualBox for this. And I have a few different virtual machines. I have some stuff from when I was compiling applications for FreeDOS and FreeDOS itself. So that's what these are for. But then I also have a couple here that I've got running recently, as in just in the last few days. So Ubuntu, and then running one of these, I have the full set of Xilinx stuff installed on it. This other one, I actually went back to an older version and put on just the tool set for the petalinux, and I didn't mess around with Vitus and Vivado and all of that stuff. And what I'm doing is I'm using this workbench system where I have this Vivado running, and then you can see here that it's a very basic. I just have the Zynq on here, and I've configured my MIO to match my memory, IO peripherals. All of that is set up to hopefully work for what I'm doing. But from this, I have gone in, I've generated the bit stream, and then I've exported that platform, and I've put that into a shared folder. So I actually have a shared folder on this computer that this virtual machine can get to. I do have a document where I kept track of my notes, I guess, as I was going through this setup. And this is the quick rundown of what I did. I loaded up VirtualBox. I have the VirtualBox extensions installed. I also came in here. I have the VirtualBox guest editions added inside of the VM. I also had to change permissions there to make sure that this shared folder. So if I come over here, I have a shared folder that anything I drop in here, the host Windows 11 PC can read and write to, as can this Linux virtual machine. I did set up all of the dependencies that petalinux needs. It fails to catch that you need this libtinfo5, so I also installed that. And then I installed the petalinux tools. After that, I had to change my shell to bash, and I think this is the command that actually let me get in and say, no, don't use dash, use bash, if I'm understanding what was happening there. Basically, this is the command that then brings up a prompt. And then I tell it that there's a folder basically where I've installed the tools for petalinux. And in there's this settings.sh that this command source dot that, and then I can just start running the different petalinux commands basically once I've run that. And I'm pretty new to Linux, so I'm kind of hacking my way through this, but learning it as I go. And then I had grabbed this hardware definition file, this XSA file, and again, I had copied it over to this shared folder, and it's just a design wrapper that I had exported so that I could use that in a project. And then I used the command petalinux create. I said create a project. I named it. I told it to use Zynq as the template, and the name I gave it was this REHSD Zynq. So that was all kind of a one-time thing for the most part. And then beyond that, I just kind of put in the commands to remind me every time I want to build or rebuild. If I want to rebuild, I just need to copy in that hardware file, an updated version of it. And then from this folder where my petalinux project is, I run petalinux-config, and I tell it to read my hardware config that I would have copied over. And then I go through and I configure the kernel and this U-boot and this root FS. And then I tell it to do a petalinux build. After that, I use this petalinux package to create basically my boot.bin file. And then I end up having to copy a few files that's generated over to my SD card. So my SD card has a couple of partitions. There's a boot partition. And so I copy this over. And then one of the files that's generated from all this work above is this file here. And I basically just extract or copy the contents of that single file into this location. And then go test and see if it works. So those are the steps I've gone through. Maybe I'm missing some stuff. I think I've tried to capture everything there just so that I remember how I did it. But those are the steps I'm going through. Now, what it kind of looks like, I guess if I want to just show you that, if I go into my home, here's petalinux. So this is where I've installed that. It's also where I've copied over this wrapper. And again, I can come over here and show that I can do things like open a terminal here. And I don't know if I think I need to do this every time. So source dot, and I point to this settings file. But from there, then I can get in and say, okay, I want to go ahead and let's just assume I just copied in a fresh hardware description file. So I went back into Vivado, I changed something in the setup of my Zynq. I export, or I create the bitstream, I export that, get it copied over here so that this can get to it. Then I can run this command here. And that command, again, if I do a directory here, oops. You can see what's in this folder. And again, I'm in this petalinux, which is this up here. This is my folder for my project, but I'm going to go ahead and just run this command. And I need to back up. Let's see, I'm not in my project file, so I need to go into this. Oh, I've called it REHSD basic, and then I'll run that. And that gets me into this, system configuration. And there's a few of these tools that I'm just kind of learning my way to get through all the different settings. But this lets me go in and modify, different settings for, in this case, the hardware configuration is what it appears that it's letting me do. So I can scroll through these things. I can go into any of these, sub, for example. Let's see, I could go into hardware settings. And in hardware settings, I could go into Ethernet settings. And right now you can see that I've turned off the DHCP client. I've said obtain IP address automatically, no. And I put in a static IP address that I want to use. But I would go through and do any other configuration here around my hardware. And then I will get out of this. I didn't mean to hit help. Then once that's done, then I can run this config for the kernel. Okay, and then it comes up with this kernel configuration. And similar to that initial hardware configuration, now I can go through here and change any options around the kernel. And I don't know what all that, I've been kind of flipping through the menus to see what's there, but I'm not necessarily changing any of these settings. So then I'll go ahead and exit out of that. And then the next thing is going to be to run a config with this boot or U-boot. So I'll get that copied and ready to go here. Okay, so now I will run this command. So the petalinux-config for the U-boot. And then after that, it will be this rootfs. And I found a couple good resources that walk through a lot of this. Phil's lab, he has a couple of videos, an earlier one and a later one in his series. But the first one especially, he goes through this whole process, and that was quite handy. And I know things have maybe changed a little bit, or I saw a few minor differences from his video. But that was quite helpful. Okay, so then I can get into the boot options when this comes up. And let's see if there's much I had changed in here. Boot media, right now I have it set to SD card and QSPI flash. And I think that's the only change I had in here. So I'm going to exit out of this. And then once that's done, I can actually do this build. Okay, so that wrapped up. And now I can change into this images Linux folder. And in that folder, if I just show you, so I'll go into my project folder, images Linux. There's a series of files there. One of the files that needs to get built that isn't built up to this point would be boot bin, and that's there because of the last time I ran this, but I need to rebuild that. Okay, that is done. And so now I would, basically what I've been doing, I'll go to devices, I'll connect up, and I have a USB SD card reader. I'll plug that in. And then I need to copy 3 of these files to the boot partition of it. And then I have another file, which is this rootfs.ext4. So this one here. And that contains essentially all the files for the OS, essentially, I believe. And this command right here will let me, from this folder over here, take the contents of that file and put it onto my second partition on the SD card. And so once that's done, then I take that card out and I plug in the SD card back into my Zynq-7000 board. And when I turn it on, I have TerraTerm connected to the UART on it, so I can see what is it outputting to that UART. And here's what you see with that. And I know this is going pretty fast as it's booting, but it seems like this is all booting off the SD card. One of the things it'll get to here in a little bit is trying to load up the Ethernet, and that is failing. I know when I was doing the Ethernet stuff inside of Vitis, I had to actually take one of the Ethernet files from the project and go get a different one from the vendor that made that PHY. And that is one of the things that actually allowed that PHY to work properly in Vitis for me. I'm going to guess that there's something in this whole Linux build, or this petalinux build, drivers, configurations, something I'm going to have to track down to make that work correctly. But you will see that wherever the Ethernet part of it is, it's not going to be successful in that portion of it. And I think there would have been something earlier in this. But then I can log in as the default petalinux, and it forces you to change a password. I change my password right away. And then I can start navigating. And for example, I can just look at what's here in this dev folder, and I'm just navigating. This looks like it's just a stripped down Linux at this point. But I can start looking around, and this is stuff I've got to figure out, learn how to work with. But this appears to all be the stuff that I built through the petalinux tools, put onto the SD card, and it's booting. So that's a really good sign in my mind. It's telling me again the main FPGA processors are working fine. The DDR must be working fine. The SD card is working fine at this point. You know, what's not working is the Ethernet. But again, I have another project that is Vivado plus Vitis, and that Ethernet is testing out perfectly fine. So it's going to come down to some driver thing or something buried inside of petalinux that I'll have to figure out. And like I commented earlier, I think there's going to be a pretty steep learning curve to this petalinux, and really learning how to really take advantage of what it has to offer. And the next thing I really want to try to figure out is how to get that Ethernet working in there, because it's not going to be such a fun operating system if I don't have network capability. But I'll do some research on that and just some digging and troubleshooting, and see what I can find out. The only last hardware thing left for me to test is to get into that USB host type of functionality. And I think with this petalinux, that should be something that I can test in fairly short order, I think, in the next couple of weeks maybe. So I'll see how that goes and see if I can get my Ethernet going. And then from there, it's just a lot of playing in the tool set and building configurations and seeing what I can do with the hardware that I've put together.